Hello, my sleepy friends. When people imagine the Titanic, they often picture the glittering dining rooms of first class, where wealthy passengers sat beneath bright electric chandeliers and enjoyed elaborate multi-course meals served on fine china. Yet far below those luxurious halls, deep within the lower decks of the great ship, another world existed. A quieter, humbler, and far more crowded world where hundreds of ordinary passengers experienced a very different version of life aboard the Titanic. These were the third-class passengers, many of them immigrants traveling toward a new future in America, and their dining experience tells a fascinating story about the everyday reality of the ship. To understand what dining in third class was like, we first need to picture the environment where these passengers lived during the voyage. Third-class accommodations were located mostly in the lower decks of the Titanic, far below the open promenades and elegant cabins of first and second class. Narrow corridors ran through these sections of the ship, lined with small but clean cabins that housed families, single travelers, and groups of workers heading across the Atlantic. Unlike older immigrant ships where passengers slept in crowded open dormitories, Titanic's designers had made an effort to create more private sleeping areas for third-class travelers. Cabins usually held 2 to 6 people, with simple metal bunks, basic bedding, and a small wash basin. But when mealtime arrived, passengers did not eat inside their cabins. Instead, they made their way to large communal dining rooms that served as gathering places for the entire third-class section. These rooms were located near the stern of the ship and were surprisingly spacious considering the number of people they served. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, accompanied by sturdy chairs bolted to the floor so they would not slide during rough seas. The atmosphere was simple but welcoming, designed to allow hundreds of passengers to eat together in an organized way. The dining rooms themselves were not decorated with luxury like the first-class restaurant above them. There were no grand chandeliers or ornate wall panels. Instead, the walls were painted white, the lighting was practical, and the furniture was built for durability rather than elegance. Yet compared to many ships of the time, the facilities were still impressive. Titanic had been designed by the White Star Line to offer better conditions for immigrant passengers than most competing ships, and providing a proper dining space was part of that effort. Meals in third class were served at regular times each day, usually 3 times. Breakfast, dinner in the middle of the day, and supper in the evening. Passengers would gather in the dining rooms when the stewards signaled that food was ready. These stewards were responsible for organizing the meals, carrying dishes from the galley kitchens, and ensuring that the large crowd of passengers received their food. Unlike first Breakfast in third class might include oatmeal porridge, bread with butter, and sometimes smoked fish such as herring. Hot tea or coffee was usually served alongside the meal, providing warmth during the cool mornings of the Atlantic crossing. The portions were filling, and the goal was to ensure that passengers had enough energy for the long days aboard the ship. The midday meal, which British ships called dinner, was usually the largest meal of the day. Passengers might receive hearty dishes such as roast beef with gravy, boiled potatoes, and vegetables like peas or carrots. Bread was served in large baskets along the tables, allowing passengers to take as much as they needed. For many travelers who came from poor rural regions of Europe, this kind of regular filling meal was a welcome comfort during the long journey. Supper in the evening tended to be slightly lighter but still satisfying. Dishes such as soup, bread, cheese, and sometimes fruit or pudding might appear on the tables. Tea remained the most common drink served with the meal, reflecting the British traditions of the ship's crew and management. What truly defined third-class dining, however, was not only the food itself but the atmosphere inside the dining room. Passengers came from many different countries, including Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe. Languages mixed together across the tables as people shared stories about the homes they had left behind and the hopes they carried for the new lives waiting in America. Children sat beside their parents while groups of young men traveling together laughed and spoke loudly across the tables. Families who had never met before the voyage often became friends during these meals, forming small communities within the crowded dining room. The shared experience of immigration created a strong sense of connection among the passengers. The sound inside the dining room could be lively. The clatter of plates, the movement of chairs, and the steady conversation of hundreds of voices echoing through the room. Yet beneath that energy, there was also a quiet feeling of anticipation. Nearly everyone seated at those long wooden tables was traveling toward a new chapter of life across the ocean. For many third-class passengers, these meals were not simply moments to eat, but opportunities to rest, talk, and briefly forget the uncertainty of the future. The Titanic itself represented a bridge between the old world and the new, and each meal served in that simple dining room was part of the long journey toward that hopeful destination. As the days of the voyage continued across the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the third-class dining room slowly became one of the most important social spaces on the Titanic for the hundreds of passengers traveling in the lower sections of the ship. While the wealthy passengers in first class enjoyed private lounges, elegant restaurants, and quiet reading rooms, third-class passengers relied heavily on the dining area as a place not only for eating, but also for gathering, talking, and sharing the long journey together. The location of the third-class dining room was carefully planned within the ship's lower decks. It sat near the stern of the Titanic, close to the areas where most third-class cabins were located. This made it easier for passengers to reach the dining hall without having to move through complicated corridors or climb too many stairways. The ship's designers understood that hundreds of people would need to enter and leave the room during each meal, so the space was built large enough to manage these crowds efficiently. Unlike many immigrant ships of the late 19th century, inside the room, the layout was simple but practical. Rows of long wooden tables filled the space from one end to the other. Each table could seat several families or groups of travelers at once. The chairs were sturdy and fixed in place so that they would remain stable even when the ship moved through rough waters. Plates, cups, and simple utensils were placed neatly on the tables by stewards before the passengers arrived. The stewards working in the third-class section had an important task. They needed to manage hundreds of passengers who spoke many different languages and came from a wide variety of cultural backgrounds. Some passengers understood English, while others spoke only their native languages such as Swedish, Italian, Irish Gaelic, or Finnish. The stewards relied on gestures, patience, and routine to guide passengers through the meal service. When mealtime approached, passengers began entering the dining room in groups. Families often stayed together while single travelers found empty seats beside strangers who quickly became temporary companions for the journey. Because the tables were long and communal, people naturally began talking to those around them, even if they had never met before. Many of the passengers traveling in third class were farmers, laborers, craftsmen, or young families seeking new opportunities in North America. The voyage itself represented a turning point in their lives. For weeks or even months before boarding the Titanic, some had traveled across Europe to reach the port of Southampton or other departure points. By the time they sat down in the dining room of the great ship, they had already experienced long journeys filled with uncertainty. Meals therefore carried a sense of comfort and routine during the voyage. Breakfast helped passengers begin the day with warmth and energy, especially during the cool mornings at sea. Dinner in the middle of the day brought the largest portions, giving travelers a filling meal that helped them endure the long hours aboard the ship. Supper in the evening allowed people to relax and reflect on another day of the journey as the ocean stretched endlessly beyond the steel walls of the vessel. Food preparation for these meals took place in large galley kitchens deeper within the ship. Massive pots and ovens were used to cook food in quantities large enough to serve the entire third-class population. The kitchen staff worked long hours to prepare bread, boil vegetables, roast meats, and serve hot drinks that could be distributed quickly once the dining room filled with passengers. Despite the simplicity of the meals compared with first class, many travelers later remembered the food as surprisingly satisfying. For people coming from poor rural regions where food could sometimes be scarce, the steady supply of bread, meat, potatoes, and tea represented a level of stability they were not always accustomed to at home. The atmosphere in the dining room reflected the diversity of the passengers themselves. One table might hold an Irish family traveling together, while the next table might include Swedish workers heading to new jobs in America. Nearby, a group of young men from Eastern Europe might sit together discussing the cities they hoped to reach once the ship arrived in New York. Children moved between the tables while parents watched carefully to keep them close. Laughter and conversation filled the room, creating a lively environment that contrasted with the quiet corridors of the sleeping areas. For many passengers, these gatherings helped reduce the loneliness that could come with leaving home behind. As the ship continued westward across the Atlantic, the third-class dining room slowly became a place where strangers formed temporary communities. People who had boarded the ship without knowing anyone soon found themselves sharing meals and stories with new companions who were traveling toward the same uncertain future. These moments inside the dining room captured an important part of the Titanic's story. While history often remembers the luxury of the upper decks, the true heart of the ship included hundreds of ordinary people sitting together at those long wooden tables eating simple meals while carrying dreams of a new life, waiting beyond the ocean. As the voyage of the Titanic continued across the vast North Atlantic, the rhythm of daily life in third class slowly settled into a predictable routine. Each day followed a familiar pattern shaped by the ship's schedule and the steady movement of the ocean beneath its steel hull. For the hundreds of third-class passengers traveling far below the elegant upper decks, meal times became important markers in that routine. dividing the long days at sea into moments of comfort and social gathering. In the morning, as the ship quietly moved through the cold Atlantic waters, passengers slowly made their way from their cabins toward the dining room. The corridors leading to the dining areas were often filled with the sound of footsteps and quiet conversation, as families and travelers prepared for the first meal of the day. The smell of warm food drifting from the kitchens often reached the hallways before passengers even entered the dining space, creating a welcoming signal that breakfast was ready. Inside the third-class dining room, the tables were already arranged by the stewards. Plates, cups, and utensils were placed neatly on the wooden surfaces, ready to serve hundreds of people who would soon fill the room. The stewards worked quickly but calmly, moving between the tables while preparing to distribute food from large serving trays carried from the galley kitchens. Breakfast for third-class passengers was designed to be simple but filling. One of the most common dishes served was oatmeal porridge, a warm meal that helped travelers begin the day with energy. Bowls of porridge were often accompanied by bread and butter, which passengers could spread generously across thick slices of bread. Smoked fish such as herring sometimes appeared as well, providing additional protein that made the meal more satisfying. Tea or coffee was served alongside the food, giving passengers something warm to drink during the cool Atlantic mornings. Many travelers sat quietly at first while eating their breakfast, still waking from sleep after the movement of the ship during the night. Gradually, the dining room became livelier as conversations began flowing between tables. The diversity of languages inside the dining room created a fascinating atmosphere. Passengers from Ireland, Scandinavia, Italy, and Eastern Europe all sat together within the same room. Although many could not speak each other's languages perfectly, gestures and smiles helped bridge the gaps. Travelers shared stories about the villages they had left behind and spoke about the cities they hoped to reach once the ship arrived in America. Children often became the first to break the quiet mood of the morning. Their curiosity about the ship and the journey sometimes led them to wander slightly from their seats, while parents gently guided them back. For many families, the voyage was the beginning of a completely new chapter in life, and even the simple experience of eating together on such a large ship felt remarkable. After breakfast, passengers returned to other parts of the third-class section of the ship. Some spent time walking along the open deck areas allowed for third-class travelers, breathing the cold ocean air and watching the endless water stretching toward the horizon. Others rested inside their cabins or gathered in small lounges designed for third-class passengers. Hours later, the midday meal approached, and once again the dining room filled with the steady flow of travelers returning for dinner. On British ships, the midday meal was called dinner rather than lunch, and it usually provided the largest portion of food served during the day. For third-class passengers, this meal often included hearty dishes such as roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables prepared in large quantities within the ship's kitchens. The preparation of these meals required careful organization behind the scenes. Large ovens roasted meats while enormous pots boiled vegetables and soups. Kitchen staff worked constantly to ensure that the food could be served quickly once the dining room filled with passengers. Because hundreds of people needed to be fed within a limited amount of time, the system relied on efficiency rather than elaborate presentation. Once the food arrived at the tables, passengers ate with enthusiasm. Many travelers had experienced long journeys across Europe before boarding the Titanic, and the regular supply of warm meals felt comforting after weeks of uncertainty. Bread baskets were passed around the table so that everyone could take additional slices if they wished. The sound inside the dining room during dinner was often louder than during breakfast. Conversations flowed more freely. Laughter spread between tables, and travelers exchanged stories about the journey so far. The shared experience of crossing the ocean created a sense of connection among people who had been strangers only days before. In many ways, the third-class dining room represented the social heart of the immigrant section of the ship. It was the place where passengers gathered, where friendships formed, and where the hopes of a new life in America were discussed over simple but satisfying meals. And as the Titanic continued moving steadily westward across the Atlantic Ocean, those long wooden tables quietly witnessed hundreds of conversations filled with excitement, uncertainty, and dreams of the future waiting beyond the sea. As the voyage continued and the great ship pushed steadily through the cold Atlantic waters, the rhythm of meals inside the third-class dining room slowly became familiar to the passengers who gathered there each day. By the time several days of the journey had passed, many travelers already knew which tables they preferred, which families sat nearby, and which companions they had begun speaking with during earlier meals. What had first been a room filled with strangers gradually turned into a small temporary community, formed by the shared experience of crossing the ocean. During the middle of the day, when the ship's bell signaled that dinner was ready, passengers once again moved through the narrow corridors toward the dining hall. Some arrived early and took their usual seats while others entered slowly, still talking with companions they had met during the voyage. The stewards continued their steady work, bringing dishes from the galley kitchens and placing them across the long tables so that everyone could reach the food easily. Dinner in third class remained the most filling meal of the day. The kitchen staff prepared large portions designed to feed hundreds of travelers who had spent the morning walking on deck or resting inside the lower cabins. One of the most common meals included roast beef, served with thick gravy poured across slices of meat. Alongside the beef came boiled potatoes, which were a staple food for many passengers, as well as vegetables such as carrots or green peas. Bread remained an essential part of every meal. Baskets filled with fresh bread were passed along the tables, allowing passengers to take as much as they wished. For many immigrants who had grown up in rural villages where food was sometimes uncertain, the steady supply of bread and hot meals on the ship felt reassuring during the long journey across the ocean. The dining room during this meal often felt lively and warm. Hundreds of voices blended together in conversation, creating a steady background sound that echoed gently through the room. The wooden chairs moved slightly as people leaned forward to speak with their neighbors, and the clatter of plates and cups added to the busy atmosphere of the space. Because passengers came from many different countries, the tables often displayed a fascinating mixture of cultures. An Irish family might sit beside Swedish laborers traveling together toward new work opportunities in America. Nearby, a group of Italian passengers might speak quickly among themselves while sharing bread and soup. Even when language barriers made communication difficult, simple gestures and smiles helped people understand one another. Children played an important role in shaping the friendly environment of the dining room. Young passengers often became curious about others sitting nearby, sometimes asking questions about the journey or pointing excitedly when the ship rocked gently with the movement of the sea. Parents watched over them carefully while still participating in conversations about the future, waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. For many of the adults seated at these tables, the voyage represented a turning point in life. Some were leaving farms where work had become scarce. Others were escaping poverty, or seeking opportunities that were not available in their home countries. The Titanic was more than a ship for them. It was a bridge between the familiar past and an uncertain but hopeful future. Between bites of food, passengers sometimes spoke quietly about the cities they hoped to reach once the ship arrived in New York. Names such as Chicago, Boston, and Detroit appeared frequently in conversations. Some had relatives already living in America who had written letters describing jobs in factories or land available for farming. As these discussions continued across the dining room, the meal gradually came to an end. Plates were cleared by the stewards, and passengers slowly stood from their seats. Some returned to their cabins while others climbed toward the deck areas where third-class travelers were allowed to walk and watch the open ocean. Later in the evening, when the final meal of the day approached, the dining room once again filled with passengers returning for supper. Compared with the large midday dinner, supper usually consisted of lighter foods such as soup, bread, cheese, and sometimes pudding or fruit when supplies allowed. Hot tea remained the most common drink served with the meal, offering warmth during the cool Atlantic evenings. The atmosphere during supper often felt calmer than earlier meals. Many passengers were tired after spending hours walking the decks or talking with new friends made during the voyage. Conversations became softer, and the dining room slowly quieted as the evening continued. Outside the steel walls of the ship, the dark ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. Inside the dining room, however, the warm light of lamps and the steady presence of shared meals helped create a sense of comfort for the hundreds of travelers making their way toward a new world. As the days of the voyage continued and the Titanic moved steadily westward across the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the experience of dining in third class became an important part of daily life for the hundreds of passengers traveling in the lower sections of the ship. What had first been unfamiliar surroundings slowly became routine, and many passengers began to feel comfortable within the large communal dining rooms where they gathered 3 times each day. By now, most travelers recognized the rhythm of the ship. The quiet mornings when breakfast was served, the lively midday dinners when the room filled with voices and laughter, and the calmer evening suppers that marked the end of another long day at sea. These meals helped divide the time of the voyage, giving structure to days that might otherwise feel long and uncertain while crossing the vast ocean. The preparation of food for third-class passengers required a remarkable amount of organization behind the scenes. Deep inside the Titanic were the galley kitchens where large teams of cooks and assistants worked throughout the day. They prepared enormous quantities of food to serve not only the wealthy passengers above, but also the hundreds of immigrants traveling in the lower decks. Massive ovens roasted meat, large pots simmered with soup or vegetables, and long preparation tables held rows of bread ready to be sliced and distributed during the meals. Because the third-class dining room served such a large number of people, the meals were designed to be practical rather than elaborate. The focus was on providing food that was filling, warm, and simple to serve in large portions. Potatoes, bread, vegetables, and meat formed the foundation of many dishes because these foods could be cooked efficiently while still offering enough nourishment for the long journey. One detail that surprised many passengers was the regularity of the meals. On older immigrant ships, food service had sometimes been irregular or poorly organized, leaving passengers uncertain about when they would eat next. On the Titanic, however, the White Star Line wanted to demonstrate that even third-class travelers would receive proper treatment. Meals arrived on schedule each day, and passengers could rely on the routine to continue throughout the voyage. The dining room itself remained an active social space during these gatherings. Travelers who had first met as strangers gradually became familiar faces at the same tables. Some passengers even began saving seats for friends they had met during earlier meals. A Swedish worker might sit beside the same Irish family each day, while nearby a group of Italian passengers gathered together to talk about the towns they hoped to reach after arriving in America. The conversations inside the dining room often focused on the future, waiting across the ocean. Many passengers carried small documents or letters from relatives already living in the United States or Canada. These letters described jobs in factories, opportunities in farming communities or neighborhoods where newcomers from their homeland had already settled. As people shared these stories during meals, the dining room filled with a sense of anticipation. For some travelers, the journey on the Titanic was the final step of a long migration that had begun months earlier. They had crossed entire countries by train or wagon, before finally reaching the port where the great ship waited to carry them across the Atlantic. The atmosphere during these meals reflected both hope and uncertainty. While many passengers spoke excitedly about their plans, others remained quiet, thinking about the families and homes they had left behind in Europe. The ocean voyage created a moment between two worlds, the past that was slowly disappearing behind them, and the future that had not yet fully arrived. Children often added warmth and energy to the dining room during these gatherings. They played quietly near the tables or asked curious questions about the ship and the sea surrounding them. For many young passengers, the Titanic felt enormous and fascinating, filled with staircases, corridors, and decks waiting to be explored under the watchful eyes of their parents. Meanwhile, the stewards continued their careful work, moving between tables to ensure that every passenger received food. Plates were collected once meals ended, and the room was prepared again for the next serving time. Their efficiency allowed the dining room to function smoothly despite the large crowds. Outside the ship, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the cold sky, its waves rising and falling as the Titanic continued its steady journey toward the American coast. Inside the third-class dining room, however, life carried on with warmth and conversation, as passengers shared simple meals while imagining the new lives waiting beyond the horizon. As the voyage progressed and the massive ship continued cutting through the deep Atlantic waters, the experience of dining in third class slowly became more than just a practical necessity for the passengers traveling below the upper decks. Over time, the dining room began to feel like a shared gathering place where the long journey across the ocean became easier to endure. For many immigrants aboard the Titanic, these meals created moments of stability during a voyage that carried them far away from the familiar places they had known all their lives. Each time passengers entered the dining room, they were greeted by the steady arrangement of long wooden tables stretching across the hall. The design of the room had been carefully planned to hold a large number of travelers at once, while still allowing space for stewards to move between the tables carrying dishes and serving trays. Although the furniture was simple and practical, the room itself was well lit and clean, offering a comfortable environment compared with many earlier immigrant ships that had treated third-class travelers far less generously. Passengers often arrived in small groups, walking through the corridors together as they followed the familiar route toward the dining area. Families stayed close to one another, while single travelers joined companions they had met during earlier meals. Over several days of the voyage, the same faces appeared again and again around the tables, creating a sense of routine and familiarity among people who had been strangers only a short time before. When the meal began, stewards placed dishes along the center of the table so that everyone seated nearby could share the food easily. This style of serving encouraged conversation between passengers sitting beside each other. Someone might pass a bowl of vegetables to a neighbor, while another traveler reached forward to cut bread from a shared basket placed in the middle of the table. The food itself continued to follow the same simple but reliable pattern that had been established earlier in the voyage. Hearty portions of meat appeared during the larger meals, accompanied by boiled potatoes and vegetables prepared in the ship's kitchens. Soup was often served during lighter meals along with bread and sometimes cheese or fruit when supplies allowed. Although the menu did not change dramatically from day to day, the meals remained satisfying and nourishing for passengers who spent much of their time walking the decks or resting in their cabins. Hot tea remained the most common drink offered to third-class passengers. The warmth of the tea helped passengers stay comfortable during the chilly Atlantic weather that surrounded the ship for most of the journey. Cups of tea often remained in travelers' hands even after the meal ended, allowing conversations to continue for a little while longer before people returned to their cabins or moved toward the open deck areas. The atmosphere in the dining room reflected the wide range of cultures traveling together aboard the Titanic. Conversations moved from table to table in many different languages. Irish accents blended with Scandinavian voices, while Italian and Eastern European languages echoed softly across the hall. Even when passengers could not fully understand each other's words, they often shared smiles, gestures, and laughter that helped create friendly connections. For many immigrants, the ship itself felt like a temporary village floating across the ocean. People who had never met before the voyage now sat side by side eating meals and discussing their hopes for life in a distant country. Stories about villages, farms, and towns left behind in Europe were exchanged during these moments around the table. In return, passengers spoke about the opportunities they believed were waiting in the cities and farmland of North America. Some passengers carried photographs of relatives who had already settled in America. During meals, they sometimes showed these small pictures to their new companions, explaining where their family members lived and what kind of work they had found. These conversations often filled the dining room with quiet excitement as travelers imagined the lives they hoped to build once the long journey was finally complete. Meanwhile, the steady movement of the ship could occasionally be felt inside the dining room as the Atlantic waves rolled beneath the hull. Plates shifted slightly on the tables, while chairs creaked softly with the motion of the vessel. For passengers who had never traveled by sea before, the sensation remained both strange and fascinating. Yet, despite the movement of the ocean outside, the warm light of the dining room and the regular rhythm of shared meals created a sense of calm within the lower decks of the Titanic. For a brief time during each meal, the uncertainty of the journey seemed to fade as hundreds of passengers gathered together to eat, talk, and imagine the new lives that awaited them on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean. As the voyage carried on, and the Titanic moved deeper into the wide, cold Atlantic, the routine of meals in third class continued to shape the daily rhythm of life for the immigrant passengers below deck. By this stage of the journey, many travelers had already settled into the habits of ship life. They knew the corridors leading to the dining room, recognized the stewards who served their meals, and had grown familiar with the people who shared their tables. For passengers who had never traveled across the ocean before, the experience of eating together inside such a large ship remained something remarkable. The Titanic was one of the biggest passenger ships ever built at that time, and even the third-class areas were larger and more organized than those found on many earlier vessels. The dining room itself served as a clear example of this improvement. Instead of crowded corners where passengers struggled to find space to eat, the ship provided a proper hall where hundreds of people could sit comfortably at the same time. The long wooden tables filled the center of the room from wall to wall. Each table held groups of passengers who gradually became familiar companions during the voyage. Families sat together while single travelers often joined others who spoke the same language or came from similar regions. Over several days, people began greeting each other warmly when they entered the dining hall, exchanging small smiles or nods before taking their seats. When the stewards brought food from the galley kitchens, large serving dishes were placed along the tables so passengers could share them easily. This style of dining encouraged cooperation among the travelers. One person might pass a bowl of vegetables down the table while another cut pieces of bread and handed them to the next person. These small actions created a sense of community among people who were all experiencing the same uncertain journey. The meals themselves continued to follow the simple but satisfying patterns that had been established earlier in the voyage. Warm soups often appeared during lighter meals, while the larger midday dinner still offered roasted meat, potatoes, and vegetables prepared in large quantities. Bread remained plentiful, and the steady presence of tea helped warm passengers during the chilly days at sea. For many travelers, the food felt generous compared with what they had experienced before leaving home. Some immigrants came from rural areas where meals depended heavily on seasonal harvests, and where meat might not appear regularly on the table. The dependable meals aboard the Titanic therefore provided both comfort and energy during the long crossing. During these meals, conversations often turned toward the future. The passengers sitting around the tables were all traveling toward new beginnings in North America. Some hoped to find work in factories in cities such as New York or Chicago. Others planned to join relatives already living in small immigrant communities across the United States and Canada. Stories about these distant places circulated through the dining room each day. Passengers spoke about letters they had received from family members describing streets filled with opportunity and factories searching for workers. Others spoke about farmland in the American countryside, where immigrants could build new homes and raise families far from the struggles they had left behind. The dining room, therefore, became a place where dreams were shared as freely as the bread placed on the tables. Travelers listened carefully to each other's experiences, imagining what their own lives might look like once the Titanic reached its destination. Children often listened quietly beside their parents while these conversations unfolded. Some looked around the room with curiosity, observing the many languages and faces gathered inside the hall. Others simply enjoyed the warmth of the room and the comforting presence of their families, while the great ship carried them toward a future they could barely imagine. Outside the dining room, the endless ocean continued stretching across the horizon, its waves rising and falling beneath the powerful engines of the Titanic. Inside the third-class dining hall, however, the atmosphere remained warm and lively, as passengers shared meals that helped make the long journey across the Atlantic feel a little more hopeful. As the voyage continued across the deep Atlantic waters and the Titanic maintained its steady course toward North America, the third-class dining room remained one of the busiest and most active places in the lower decks of the ship. For the immigrant passengers traveling in these sections, the dining room was more than simply a place to receive food. It was where the rhythms of the voyage became most visible, where hundreds of lives briefly crossed paths several times each day, and where the long ocean journey felt a little more human and familiar. By this point in the crossing, most passengers already understood the routine that shaped daily life aboard the ship. The bells signaling meals had become recognizable sounds within the corridors of the third-class sections. When those signals echoed through the lower decks, travelers slowly made their way toward the dining hall, walking through narrow passageways while the ship quietly moved beneath their feet. Inside the dining room, the atmosphere often shifted depending on the time of day. During the morning meal, the room tended to feel calmer. Passengers entered quietly, many still adjusting to the movement of the ship after waking from sleep. The warm food served at breakfast helped passengers prepare for another long day aboard the vessel as it continued its journey across the open ocean. During the midday dinner, however, the dining hall became far more energetic. This was the largest meal of the day, and passengers arrived with healthy appetites after spending hours walking the decks or resting inside their cabins. The room filled quickly with voices as people sat down beside companions they had grown used to seeing at the same tables. The stewards moved efficiently between the rows of tables, carrying large dishes from the galley kitchens and distributing food to the passengers waiting patiently. Their work required careful coordination because hundreds of people needed to be served within a limited amount of time. Plates were placed in front of travelers, bread baskets were passed along the tables, and warm dishes were shared among groups seated together. Despite the large number of passengers present, the dining process often unfolded smoothly. The system had been carefully organized so that the flow of people entering and leaving the room remained steady. While one group finished eating, another group might already be preparing to take their seats for the next meal service. One of the most interesting aspects of third-class dining on the Titanic was the mixture of cultures gathered around the same tables. Passengers from Ireland, Scandinavia, Italy, Eastern Europe, and other regions of the continent all traveled together within the same section of the ship. Many had never met people from such different backgrounds before the voyage. This diversity became visible during the meals. Different accents filled the room while travelers spoke about their homes, families, and plans for the future. Even when language barriers existed, simple gestures and friendly smiles often helped people communicate across those differences. Sometimes passengers attempted to learn a few words from each other's languages during these meals. A Swedish traveler might repeat an English phrase after hearing it spoken by an Irish passenger, while an Italian family might share the names of foods from their homeland with the people sitting beside them. These small exchanges created moments of curiosity and connection during the long days at sea. The shared dining experience also helped ease the loneliness that some passengers felt during the voyage. Many immigrants had left behind parents, friends, and familiar communities in Europe. Sitting together around the long tables allowed them to form temporary friendships with others who understood the emotional weight of leaving home behind. Children continued to bring energy to the dining room as well. Their laughter and curiosity often brightened the atmosphere, reminding everyone that the journey represented hope for the next generation as much as it did opportunity for the adults making the crossing. While the passengers talked and shared their meals, the Titanic continued moving steadily across the Atlantic outside the steel walls of the ship. The powerful engines deep below deck drove the vessel forward through the cold water, carrying hundreds of dreams toward the distant shores of America. Inside the third-class dining room, however, the focus remained on the simple human moments happening around the tables. Plates were shared, conversations continued, and travelers slowly built a small sense of community during the days they spent together aboard one of the most famous ships ever built. As the Titanic continued its steady westward journey through the North Atlantic, life inside the third-class dining rooms settled into a rhythm that many passengers began to rely on. Days at sea could feel long and uncertain, especially for immigrants who had never traveled far from home before. The endless horizon of water outside the ship could make time feel strangely slow. Because of this, the regular gatherings for meals became important moments that brought structure and familiarity to the voyage. Each meal drew hundreds of passengers back into the same shared space, where the long wooden tables slowly filled with travelers who had begun recognizing one another from previous days. Some passengers naturally formed small groups with others who spoke the same language, while others enjoyed sitting beside new people each day and learning about places far beyond their own hometowns. The stewards working in the third-class section were now familiar faces to many passengers. These crew members moved carefully through the dining hall, carrying large serving dishes from the kitchens below. Their work required patience and organization because the room often held hundreds of travelers at once. Plates were placed along the tables, food was distributed quickly, and the steady flow of service ensured that everyone received their meal without confusion. Behind the dining room walls, the Titanic's kitchens remained constantly active. Preparing food for such a large ship required enormous effort. The galley kitchens cooked meals for every class aboard the ship, from the wealthy passengers in the elegant restaurants above to the immigrant travelers gathered in the third-class dining halls. Large ovens baked bread throughout the day, while enormous cooking pots simmered with soups, vegetables, and stews, prepared in quantities large enough to serve hundreds of people. Even though the menu remained fairly simple, the meals still provided comfort and strength during the long crossing. Many passengers later remembered how satisfying it felt to receive warm food at regular times each day. For immigrants who had spent weeks traveling across Europe before boarding the ship, the stability of these meals offered a welcome sense of routine. As people ate, conversations continued to fill the room with a steady hum of voices. Some travelers shared stories about the towns they had left behind in Ireland or Scandinavia. Others spoke about relatives waiting for them in American cities, where immigrant communities had already formed. These discussions often turned toward the hopes and expectations that each passenger carried across the ocean. A young couple might talk about finding work in New York. A group of laborers might discuss factory jobs waiting in Chicago or Detroit. Families spoke quietly about farms they hoped to build, or neighborhoods where relatives had promised to help them begin their new lives. For many passengers, the dining room became the place where these dreams felt most real. Sitting among others who were making the same journey created a powerful sense of shared purpose. Although everyone came from different backgrounds, they were all traveling toward the same destination across the sea. The physical surroundings of the dining room remained simple throughout the voyage. The walls were painted in light colors, and the lighting was practical rather than decorative. The furniture was strong and functional, designed to handle the constant movement of passengers during each meal. Yet despite the lack of luxury, the room felt welcoming because of the warmth created by the people gathered there. Children continued to add energy to the space. They often finished their meals quickly and looked around the room with curiosity, observing the many unfamiliar languages and customs surrounding them. Parents kept a close watch on them while still participating in conversations about the future waiting beyond the Atlantic. Occasionally, the gentle motion of the ship could be felt inside the dining hall. Cups shifted slightly on the tables while chairs creaked softly as the vessel rolled across the waves. For passengers unused to ocean travel, these movements remained a constant reminder that they were far from land, traveling across one of the largest oceans on Earth. Yet the steady presence of shared meals helped create a feeling of stability within the lower decks of the Titanic. Even while the ocean stretched endlessly outside, life inside the dining room continued with familiar patterns. Food arriving from the kitchens, travelers gathering around the tables, conversations rising and fading as the meal progressed. And while the massive ship continued moving quietly through the cold Atlantic night and day, the third-class dining room remained one of the few places where hundreds of ordinary passengers could come together, eat simple meals, and imagine the new lives that awaited them on the distant shores of America. As the Titanic continued its calm journey across the wide Atlantic, the experience of dining in third class slowly became one of the most familiar and comforting parts of daily life for the passengers traveling far below the grand staircases and luxurious salons of the upper decks. For many immigrants aboard the ship, these meals were not simply about eating. They were small moments where people paused from the long uncertainty of travel and found themselves surrounded by others sharing the same journey toward an unknown future. By this stage of the voyage, the third-class dining room had developed its own quiet rhythm. The same passengers began appearing at the same tables each day. Families often chose certain seats where children felt comfortable, and parents could easily talk with neighbors they had come to know. Groups of young workers who had boarded together naturally gathered at the same places along the long wooden tables, speaking in their native languages, while discussing the plans waiting for them across the ocean. The dining room itself remained one of the largest indoor spaces available to third-class passengers. Its wide floor allowed hundreds of travelers to gather without feeling completely crowded, though the room could still become lively and full of movement when everyone arrived for the midday meal. The sound of voices echoing through the hall often blended with the quiet rumble of the ship's engines far below, creating a background noise that reminded passengers they were traveling aboard one of the largest ships ever built. Stewards continued their careful work during every meal. Moving between tables with practiced efficiency, they carried large serving dishes filled with food prepared in the ship's kitchens. Plates were placed in front of passengers while bread baskets moved slowly along the tables from one group to another. The process repeated itself several times each day with remarkable consistency. The food itself remained simple but nourishing. Thick slices of bread, bowls of soup, roasted meats, potatoes, and vegetables appeared regularly during the larger meals. While the menu did not change dramatically from day to day, the portions were generous enough to keep travelers satisfied during the long journey. For many passengers, the steady supply of warm meals felt reassuring, especially after leaving behind homes where food had sometimes been difficult to obtain. Tea continued to be served with most meals, its warmth providing comfort during the cool ocean weather that surrounded the ship. Passengers often held their cups while continuing quiet conversations with the people seated beside them. These conversations frequently returned to the topic that filled many hearts aboard the Titanic, the promise of a new beginning in America. Some passengers spoke about the letters they had received from relatives describing life in New York or Boston. Others talked about farmland in the American Midwest where immigrants could build new homes and raise families far from the economic struggles they had faced in Europe. Each story added another layer to the shared imagination of the future waiting beyond the sea. Children sometimes listened quietly while these discussions unfolded around them. Although they might not fully understand the importance of the journey, they sensed the excitement and hope in the voices of their parents and neighbors. For them, the Titanic itself felt like an enormous moving world filled with endless corridors, staircases, and decks to explore. Occasionally, a passenger might stand from the table and walk toward one of the small windows along the dining room walls. Through these windows, the endless Atlantic could sometimes be seen stretching across the horizon. The sight reminded everyone that they were far from land, carried across the ocean by the steady power of the ship's engines. Yet inside the dining room, the atmosphere remained warm and social. The combination of shared meals, conversation, and the simple routine of daily life helped create a small community among people who had never met before boarding the ship. For a short time during each meal, the worries of the journey seemed to fade as passengers focused on the food before them and the companions sitting nearby. These moments captured a quiet side of the Titanic story that is often overlooked. While the upper decks displayed luxury and wealth, the lower decks held hundreds of ordinary lives filled with hope, courage, and determination. Around those long wooden tables in the third-class dining room, immigrants shared simple meals while imagining the new lives waiting for them across the ocean. As the voyage continued and the Titanic steadily crossed the vast Atlantic, the routine of meals in third class remained one of the most dependable parts of life aboard the ship. For many passengers, the days at sea could sometimes feel long and uncertain. The endless stretch of water outside the ship's hull created a strange sense of distance from the world they had left behind. Because of this, the regular gatherings in the dining room helped create a feeling of stability for the hundreds of immigrants traveling below deck. By now, the third-class passengers had grown comfortable with the spaces where they spent most of their time. The corridors leading toward the dining hall were familiar, and the long wooden tables inside the room were often occupied by the same groups of travelers who had begun to recognize each other during the earlier days of the journey. Many passengers greeted one another with quiet smiles or friendly nods before sitting down for another meal. The dining room itself remained simple but well organized. Its wide floor and strong furniture allowed the space to accommodate a large number of people at once. The chairs were firmly placed beside the tables, and the walls were painted in light colors that helped the room feel bright even in the lower decks of the ship. Lamps provided steady lighting so that meals could continue comfortably, even when the evening darkness spread across the Atlantic outside. Behind the scenes, the kitchens of the Titanic remained busy throughout the day, preparing food for every passenger aboard the ship. Large ovens baked bread while cooks prepared meats, vegetables, and soups in massive cooking pots. The scale of these kitchens reflected the enormous size of the ship itself. Feeding more than 2,000 people during a long ocean voyage required constant organization and careful planning. When the time for meals arrived, stewards carried trays of food from the kitchens into the dining hall. Their work followed a steady rhythm that had become familiar to the passengers. Plates were placed along the tables. Dishes were shared between travelers sitting nearby, and the room slowly filled with the sounds of eating and conversation. The meals themselves continued to focus on simple foods that could be prepared efficiently for large groups. Soup often appeared during the lighter meals, while roasted meats, potatoes, and vegetables formed the center of the larger dinners. Bread remained a constant presence on the tables, with baskets passed along so that passengers could take additional slices whenever they wished. For many immigrants, the steady supply of food during the voyage remained impressive. Some passengers had traveled through difficult conditions before reaching the port where they boarded the Titanic. Compared with the uncertainty of those earlier journeys, the dependable meals aboard the ship offered a sense of comfort. Conversations around the tables continued to revolve around the future. Passengers discussed the places they hoped to reach once the ship arrived in North America. Some planned to settle in busy cities where factories and construction projects promised employment. Others hoped to travel farther inland to rural areas where farmland could be purchased or rented. These discussions often lasted long after the meal itself had finished. Travelers leaned back in their chairs while speaking quietly with those around them, exchanging information about relatives, jobs, and neighborhoods where immigrants from their home countries had already begun building new communities. Children occasionally grew restless during these long conversations. After finishing their meals, they looked around the room with curiosity, watching the many different people gathered in the hall. Some whispered to their parents, while others simply observed the unfamiliar languages being spoken across the tables. Outside the dining room, the ship continued its powerful movement through the ocean. Deep within the Titanic's hull, the engines worked constantly, turning massive propellers that pushed the ship forward through the cold Atlantic waters. Passengers could sometimes feel a gentle vibration beneath their feet, a reminder that the great vessel was carrying them steadily closer to their destination. Inside the third-class dining room, however, the focus remained on the shared human experience unfolding around the tables. Travelers from distant countries sat side by side eating simple meals while imagining the lives they hoped to build across the ocean. These quiet gatherings formed one of the most meaningful parts of the voyage for many passengers. Around those long wooden tables, strangers slowly became companions in a journey that would forever change their lives. As the voyage moved deeper into the Atlantic and the Titanic continued its calm passage across the open sea, life inside the third-class sections of the ship began to feel almost routine for many passengers. The unfamiliar environment that had seemed overwhelming during the first days of the journey slowly became familiar. Travelers knew where the corridors led, which stairways connected the lower decks, and how to find the dining room when the time for meals arrived. For hundreds of immigrants aboard the ship, the dining hall remained one of the few places where nearly everyone gathered together. Outside the room, passengers might be scattered across cabins, small lounges, or the limited deck areas available to third-class travelers. But during mealtimes, the entire community returned to the same shared space, filling the room with voices, movement, and the sound of dishes being placed across the long wooden tables. The regular appearance of food helped structure the long days at sea. Breakfast began the morning with warm meals that prepared passengers for another day aboard the ship. The midday dinner brought larger portions and lively conversation, while supper in the evening allowed people to relax before returning to their cabins for the night. These repeated gatherings gave the voyage a sense of rhythm that helped ease the uncertainty many passengers felt while traveling far from home. The stewards continued their steady work during every meal. Their responsibilities required patience and organization because the dining room served such a large group of travelers. Plates were arranged along the tables, serving dishes were carried carefully through the crowded hall, and bread baskets moved from one group of passengers to the next. Even though the room could be busy and noisy at times, the process of serving meals usually unfolded smoothly. Behind the scenes, the Titanic's kitchens remained constantly active. Cooking for thousands of people required large teams of workers preparing food throughout the day. Massive ovens baked bread in continuous batches, while cooks stirred large pots filled with soup, vegetables, or stewed meats. The scale of the operation reflected the enormous size of the ship itself. The meals served in third class continued to follow the same simple but nourishing style that passengers had experienced earlier in the voyage. Soups, bread, roasted meats, potatoes, and vegetables appeared regularly on the tables. Although the menu did not offer the variety found in the luxurious dining rooms of first class, The food was reliable and filling. For many immigrants, this consistency provided comfort during the long crossing. Leaving home had often required difficult choices and uncertain journeys across Europe before even reaching the port of departure. Sitting down to a warm meal on a ship carrying them toward a new life gave travelers a moment of calm during a period filled with change. The atmosphere in the dining room reflected the mixture of cultures traveling together. Different languages echoed across the hall while passengers shared stories about the places they had left behind. Some described quiet villages surrounded by farmland, while others spoke about crowded cities where work had become difficult to find. At other tables, passengers discussed their hopes for the future waiting in America. Letters from relatives who had already emigrated were often mentioned during these conversations. These letters described neighborhoods filled with immigrants from the same homeland, factories looking for workers or farmland where families could begin new lives. Children listened quietly to many of these conversations while eating beside their parents. Although they might not fully understand the importance of the journey, they sensed the excitement and hope surrounding them. For them, the Titanic felt enormous and mysterious, a floating world carrying them across an ocean they had never seen before. Occasionally, the gentle motion of the sea reminded passengers that they were traveling across one of the largest bodies of water on Earth. Plates shifted slightly on the tables while the ship rolled softly over the waves. Yet the strength and size of the Titanic made the movement feel steady and controlled. Inside the dining room, the warm lighting and familiar faces helped create a feeling of comfort that contrasted with the vast emptiness of the ocean outside. Around the long wooden tables, passengers continued sharing meals, while imagining the lives waiting for them on the far side of the Atlantic. As the days of the voyage continued and the Titanic steadily advanced through the cold Atlantic waters, the dining routine in third class became deeply familiar to the passengers who gathered there. What had once felt like a temporary arrangement for strangers slowly turned into a shared environment where people began recognizing one another's habits, voices, and daily routines. The dining room had quietly become one of the social centers of life for the immigrant passengers aboard the ship. Each day followed a pattern that passengers soon expected. In the morning, the room slowly filled with travelers arriving for breakfast, often still adjusting to the gentle motion of the ship beneath their feet. Some entered quietly, still waking from sleep in their cabins, while others arrived already engaged in conversation with companions they had met earlier in the voyage. The stewards moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, placing dishes of warm food along the wooden surfaces as passengers took their seats. Breakfast continued to be simple but filling. Bowls of warm porridge were often served along with bread and butter, while smoked fish occasionally appeared as well. Tea or coffee accompanied the meal, bringing warmth during the chilly Atlantic mornings. For many passengers, these breakfasts provided the energy needed to begin another long day aboard the ship. After breakfast, the dining room slowly emptied as passengers returned to other areas of the third-class section. Some walked the open deck spaces allowed to them, enjoying the fresh ocean air and watching the endless waves stretching toward the horizon. Others remained inside, resting in their cabins or speaking quietly with friends they had made during the voyage. By midday, the dining room filled again for the largest meal of the day. The midday dinner brought a lively atmosphere as travelers gathered around the long tables. Plates of roasted meat, potatoes, and vegetables were shared among the passengers, while baskets of bread moved steadily from one group to another. The room echoed with conversation as people discussed their plans for the future waiting across the ocean. Many passengers spoke about the cities they hoped to reach once the ship arrived in New York. Chicago, Boston, and Detroit were often mentioned as places where work could be found in factories and workshops. Others talked about farmland in rural areas where immigrants might build new homes and begin farming their own land. These conversations reflected the hopes carried by nearly everyone aboard the Titanic in third class. Each person seated at those tables had chosen to leave behind familiar surroundings in Europe in order to search for opportunity in a distant country. The ship itself represented a bridge between those two worlds. During the evening supper, the atmosphere often became calmer. The long day aboard the ship left many passengers tired, and conversations grew quieter as people finished their meals. Lighter foods such as soup, bread, and cheese appeared on the tables while tea continued to be served alongside the dishes. Children sometimes listened quietly while their parents spoke about the future. Although the younger passengers might not fully understand the significance of the journey, they sensed the mixture of excitement and uncertainty surrounding the adults in the room. The steady presence of the dining room created a sense of continuity during the voyage. No matter what the weather was like outside or how long the ocean journey felt, passengers could rely on the regular schedule of meals. These gatherings allowed people to share stories, exchange information, and support one another during a moment in their lives filled with change. Beyond the walls of the dining room, the Titanic continued its powerful journey across the Atlantic, its engines driving the massive ship forward through the cold waters of the ocean. But inside the third-class dining hall, hundreds of travelers continued sharing simple meals together, forming temporary friendships as they moved closer to the new lives waiting beyond the horizon. As the great ship continued its journey across the wide Atlantic Ocean, the dining room in third class remained one of the most constant parts of daily life for the immigrant passengers. The vast steel vessel moved forward through cold northern waters day and night. Yet inside the lower decks, the rhythm of meals continued with steady reliability. For many passengers, these gatherings became the moments when the long crossing felt most human and most familiar. By this point in the voyage, many of the travelers had grown used to the movement of the ship. During the first days, some passengers had needed time to adjust to the gentle rise and fall of the ocean beneath them. But as the journey continued, the motion became a normal part of life aboard the Titanic. Plates might shift slightly on the tables during rougher moments of sea, and chairs sometimes creaked softly as the ship rolled across the waves. Yet the massive vessel remained stable enough that meals could continue comfortably in the dining room. Passengers arriving for meals now often greeted one another with recognition. The same faces appeared again and again around the long wooden tables. People who had boarded the ship as strangers gradually became familiar companions during the voyage. Small conversations began even before the food arrived, with travelers asking about the weather on deck or discussing how the journey was progressing. When the stewards entered carrying dishes from the kitchens, the room slowly filled with the sounds of plates being placed on the tables and bread baskets being passed along the rows of passengers. The work of the stewards remained essential to the smooth operation of the dining room. They moved quickly but carefully between the crowded tables, ensuring that each group received their meal. The food served in third class continued to follow the same dependable pattern that had been established throughout the voyage. Large portions of meat, potatoes, and vegetables appeared during the main dinner meal, while lighter dishes such as soup and bread were offered during supper. Although the meals lacked the elegance of the upper-class dining rooms, they were filling and reliable, providing the energy needed for passengers spending long days aboard the ship. For many immigrants, the regular meals offered something more important than variety or luxury. They provided reassurance during a time when nearly everything else in life was changing. Leaving one's homeland behind meant stepping into an uncertain future, and the steady routine of eating together helped passengers maintain a sense of normal life while crossing the ocean. Conversations during these meals often drifted toward memories of home. Passengers spoke about the villages they had left behind, describing farms, narrow streets, and familiar churches in their native countries. Others listened with interest, sometimes discovering that their hometowns were not as distant from each other as they had first imagined. At other moments, the discussions turned toward the future waiting across the Atlantic. Some travelers described letters from relatives who had already settled in America and written back with news of opportunity. Factories in large cities were often searching for workers, and many immigrants hoped to find employment there once they arrived. Families traveling together sometimes spoke quietly about the homes they hoped to build in the new country. Parents imagined schools for their children and steady work that could support their families. These conversations filled the dining room with quiet hope that stretched far beyond the walls of the ship. Children continued to bring warmth and curiosity to the atmosphere of the dining hall. They watched the stewards moving through the room, observed the different foods being served, and occasionally looked toward the small windows along the walls where glimpses of the ocean could sometimes be seen. For them, the ship itself remained an enormous and fascinating place. Meanwhile, the Titanic continued its powerful journey beneath the open sky. Deep within the ship's hull, the engines worked steadily, turning the massive propellers that pushed the vessel through the cold Atlantic waters. Above the dining room, the higher decks carried passengers enjoying luxurious surroundings. Yet far below those elegant spaces, the immigrant travelers gathered around simple wooden tables, sharing meals and stories during the long crossing. Inside the third-class dining room, the atmosphere remained warm and communal as hundreds of passengers continued their journey together toward the distant shores of America. As the voyage moved further into the Atlantic and the great ship continued its steady progress through the cold northern waters, the dining rooms in the third-class sections of the Titanic remained among the most active places on the ship. For the immigrant passengers traveling below deck, these meals had become quiet anchors in the middle of an uncertain journey. The ocean outside stretched endlessly in every direction, but inside the dining hall, life continued with the same steady rhythm each day. By now, many passengers had settled comfortably into the routines of ship life. They knew the times when meals were served, the routes through the narrow corridors that led to the dining room, and the faces of the stewards who moved between the tables carrying dishes from the kitchens. Some passengers even arrived early, choosing the same seats they had used during previous meals so they could sit beside familiar companions. When the doors of the dining room opened, travelers slowly filled the space once again. The long wooden tables stretched across the hall, already prepared with plates, cups, and simple utensils arranged neatly by the stewards. Lamps hanging from the ceiling cast a warm and steady light across the room, reflecting softly against the pale painted walls. Although the room lacked the ornate decorations of the upper-class dining areas, it felt welcoming because of the activity and voices of the passengers gathered there. As the meal began, the stewards placed large serving dishes along the center of the table so that passengers could share the food easily. Bread baskets were passed from one person to another, while bowls of vegetables and plates of meat moved slowly along the length of the table. This style of serving naturally encouraged interaction between travelers. A passenger might pass potatoes to someone seated beside them, while another traveler reached forward to cut slices of bread for the group. The food continued to follow the same practical style that had been served throughout the voyage. Warm soups appeared frequently, along with roasted meats, boiled potatoes, and vegetables cooked in the ship's kitchens below. Bread remained plentiful, and tea continued to be served during nearly every meal. The dishes were simple, but the portions were generous enough to satisfy passengers who spent much of their time walking the decks or resting inside the lower cabins. During these meals, conversations flowed easily across the room. Travelers who had once been strangers now spoke comfortably with one another. Some passengers discussed the towns they had left behind in Ireland, Norway, Sweden, or Italy, describing familiar landscapes and villages that were now slowly fading into memory as the ship carried them farther from Europe. Other discussions focused on the future waiting across the Atlantic. Passengers talked about relatives who had already emigrated and sent letters describing life in American cities. New York was often mentioned as the place where the ship would arrive, but many travelers planned to continue farther inland to cities like Chicago or to farming communities in the Midwest, where immigrants had already begun building new lives. These conversations often filled the dining room with a quiet sense of anticipation. The journey aboard the Titanic represented more than just a voyage across the ocean. For many passengers, it marked the beginning of a completely different chapter in their lives. Children sat beside their parents listening to these discussions while enjoying their meals. Sometimes they looked around the room with curiosity, observing the many unfamiliar languages and faces gathered at the tables. The ship itself remained a fascinating environment for young travelers who had never experienced anything so large or complex. While these quiet scenes unfolded inside the dining room, the Titanic continued its powerful movement across the Atlantic outside. Deep beneath the passengers' feet, the engines worked steadily, turning enormous propellers that pushed the massive vessel forward through the cold, dark waters. Yet inside the third-class dining hall, the atmosphere remained calm and social. Around those long wooden tables, hundreds of immigrants continued sharing simple meals while imagining the opportunities and challenges waiting for them in a new world across the sea. As the long Atlantic voyage continued and the Titanic carried its passengers steadily westward toward North America, the daily rhythm of dining in third class remained one of the most familiar experiences for the immigrants traveling below the ship's upper decks. By this point in the journey, the dining hall had become more than simply a place where meals were served. It had quietly turned into the social center of life for many of the passengers who gathered there day after day. Each time the doors opened for a meal, the same slow movement began through the corridors of the third-class sections. Families stepped out of their cabins together, while single travelers walked beside companions they had met earlier in the voyage. The passageways gradually filled with the sound of footsteps as people followed the now familiar route toward the dining room. Inside the hall, the arrangement remained unchanged. The long wooden tables stretched across the room in neat rows, surrounded by sturdy chairs that had been secured in place so they would not slide when the ship moved across the ocean. The lamps above cast a warm glow across the room, giving the dining hall a welcoming atmosphere despite its simple design. Passengers slowly took their seats as the room filled with voices and quiet greetings. By now, many travelers recognized one another from previous meals. A Swedish worker might sit beside the same Irish family he had spoken with during earlier dinners, while a group of Italian passengers gathered again at a table where they had shared meals throughout the journey. The stewards moved between the tables, preparing the room for service. Their work had become a familiar sight to the passengers. Large serving dishes were carried carefully through the dining hall, and plates were arranged along the table so that each traveler would receive their portion of food once the meal began. Behind the scenes, the Titanic's kitchens continued their enormous task of feeding the ship's population. Large ovens baked bread continuously, while cooks prepared soups, roasted meats, and vegetables in quantities large enough to serve hundreds of people at once. The size of these kitchens reflected the scale of the ship itself, which carried more than 2,000 passengers and crew across the Atlantic. When the meal was served, passengers began sharing the food placed along the tables. Bread baskets passed from hand to hand while bowls of vegetables moved slowly between travelers. Plates of roasted meat and potatoes were divided among the groups seated together. Although the menu remained simple compared with the luxurious dining rooms of first class, the food was warm, filling, and dependable. For many immigrants, this reliability meant a great deal. The journey across the Atlantic had required courage and sacrifice. Leaving home, family members, and familiar surroundings behind was never easy. The routine of gathering around the tables each day helped create moments of comfort during a period filled with uncertainty. Conversations continued to flow throughout the dining room as passengers spoke about both the past and the future. Some described the villages and towns they had left behind in Europe, remembering landscapes that were now thousands of miles away. Others spoke with excitement about the possibilities waiting in America, the promise of work, the chance to build homes, and the hope of creating better lives for their families. Children listened quietly while these conversations unfolded around them. For many of them, the Titanic itself was the largest and most impressive thing they had ever seen. The ship felt like a small moving world filled with corridors, staircases, and endless rooms waiting to be explored. Occasionally, someone might glance toward the small windows along the dining room walls where glimpses of the ocean could be seen. Outside those windows, the Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, its dark waters rising and falling beneath the massive hull of the ship. Yet inside the third-class dining hall, the atmosphere remained warm and lively. The sound of voices, the passing of bread and dishes across the tables, and the quiet sharing of hopes for the future created a sense of community among the passengers. Around those simple wooden tables, hundreds of ordinary people continued their journey together, eating, talking, and imagining the new lives waiting for them beyond the wide ocean that the Titanic was steadily crossing. As the final days of the voyage approached and the Titanic continued its steady path across the dark Atlantic waters, the rhythm of meals in the third-class dining room carried on just as it had since the beginning of the journey. For the immigrant passengers traveling deep within the ship, the dining hall had become one of the most familiar spaces in their temporary floating world. The long wooden tables, the warm lamps hanging above, and the steady movement of the stewards had formed a routine that many travelers quietly depended on during the long crossing. By this stage of the voyage, the passengers who gathered in the dining room were no longer strangers. Over several days of shared meals and conversations, many had grown comfortable speaking with the same companions who sat beside them. A Norwegian fisherman might exchange greetings with an Irish family across the table, while a group of young laborers from southern Europe laughed together as they waited for the meal to begin. Though they came from different countries and spoke different languages, the experience of crossing the ocean together had created a quiet bond among them. When the meal was served, the same familiar pattern unfolded across the room. Large serving dishes were placed along the center of the tables, allowing passengers to share the food easily. Bread was passed from one person to the next, Bowls of vegetables moved slowly along the rows, and plates of meat and potatoes were divided among those seated together. The food remained simple but satisfying, just as it had been throughout the journey. While they ate, many passengers continued discussing the lives they hoped to build once the ship reached New York. Some talked about relatives who would be waiting at the harbor when the Titanic arrived. Others spoke about factories, farms, and small businesses where they planned to begin working as soon as they reached the new country. Each conversation carried a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, the feeling that something important was about to begin. Children sat beside their parents, quietly finishing their meals while listening to the voices around them. The younger passengers sometimes looked around the room with curiosity, watching the stewards move through the hall or listening to the many languages echoing through the dining room. For them, the ship itself felt enormous and mysterious, a place filled with endless corridors and distant decks. Outside the walls of the ship, the Atlantic remained vast and silent beneath the night sky. The Titanic moved forward through the cold waters with powerful engines turning deep below the passengers' feet. The great vessel had been built to cross the ocean with confidence and strength, carrying thousands of travelers safely between continents. Inside the third-class dining room, however, life continued in a quieter and more personal way. Around the simple wooden tables, hundreds of immigrants shared meals that represented the final days of a journey that would soon change their lives forever. They ate, talked, and imagined the new homes waiting for them beyond the horizon. These moments inside the dining hall reveal an important part of the Titanic's story that is sometimes forgotten. While the ship is often remembered for its luxury and grandeur, it was also a vessel filled with ordinary people carrying hopes for the future. In the third-class dining room, those hopes were shared daily across plates of simple food and cups of warm tea as the ship crossed the ocean. And so the meals in that modest dining hall became small chapters in the larger story of the Titanic's voyage. Quiet gatherings where strangers became companions, where dreams of a new life were spoken aloud, and where hundreds of travelers continued their journey toward the distant shores of America. As this long, calm history comes to an end, imagine the dining room slowly growing quiet once more as passengers return to their cabins and the ship continues its journey through the night. The lamps dim slightly, the tables rest empty for a few hours, and the vast Atlantic surrounds the ship on every side. If you enjoyed drifting through this slow journey into the past, you can gently support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing, so we can continue exploring more quiet and fascinating corners of history together.